The fire has gone out. The wind howls through the cracks in the cabin walls. Outside, the snow is rising, and inside, a child shivers in silence. There's no backup plan. No help is coming. If the family doesn't act now, they won't see the sunrise. Winter on the American frontier wasn't just a test of strength. It was a daily gamble with death. Without central heating, grocery stores, or emergency services, settlers relied on generations of trial and error wisdom to endure what nature threw at them. During the long months of darkness and bone-deep cold, survival meant mastering a complex system of strategies, honed through necessity, passed down through families, and forgotten by modern comfort. This is the story of how frontier families survived the coldest nights in the wilderness. The most dangerous nights on the frontier weren't necessarily the ones filled with howling blizzards or thick snowfall. They were the still, silent ones. Nights when the wind stopped, and with it, all signs of life vanished. The temperature could plunge suddenly and mercilessly, turning a modest log cabin into a cold tomb before sunrise. There were no thermostats, no space heaters, and no second chances. The only thing standing between a family and death by exposure was their ability to capture, store, and manage heat with a precision that bordered on scientific. Frontier families developed what would later be recognized as a form of passive thermal engineering. They didn't call it that, of course. To them, it was simply common sense born from desperation. They constructed a heat banking system, a way of transforming short bursts of intense fire into long-lasting, evenly distributed warmth that could last through the night. At the heart of this system was the principle of thermal mass. They learned through trial and necessity that dense, heavy materials like iron, stone, and brick absorbed heat when placed close to a fire, and then slowly radiated it over time. After cooking the evening meal, families would take iron kettles, flat river stones, or ceramic jugs, heat them in the coals, and then carefully remove and wrap them in layers of wool, linen, or fur. These improvised heaters were then slipped under beds, tucked into cribs, or placed near seating areas to provide localized warmth. Some families even sewed dedicated pouches into blankets, specifically to hold these heat sources. But this wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it method. The system demanded meticulous planning and timing. Let the fire burn too hot for too long, and you'd waste precious wood that couldn't be easily replenished. Let it burn too little, and you risked waking to frost-covered children or water-frozen solid indoors. Families learned to bank the fire, a technique in which glowing coals were carefully covered with a thick layer of ash before bed. This smothered the flames but preserved the heat, allowing the fire to reignite easily in the morning with minimal wood and effort. Placement mattered too. Heated objects were strategically distributed throughout the cabin. Stones were lined along walls to prevent cold seepage from exterior logs. Blankets were draped over doorways and staircases, not just for privacy, but to trap warm air in occupied spaces. Beds were often positioned in thermal zones, the warmest corners of the room, away from windows or open walls. Some families even engineered airflow inside their cabins. By creating makeshift ventilation channels, such as placing a curtain to guide warm air towards sleeping quarters, they could influence convection currents. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and these families understood it intuitively. Hanging heavy blankets from ceiling beams created heat pockets where children could sleep relatively warm even when the rest of the cabin was near freezing. What's often forgotten is that fuel was finite. Hauling and chopping wood in deep snow was exhausting and dangerous. Injuries during winter could be fatal. So this heat banking system also acted as a form of fuel conservation, stretching every log's warmth to its maximum potential. It allowed families to use less wood while still maintaining survivable temperatures, especially important during blizzards or isolation periods when wood piles couldn't be replenished. And then there was the human element, heat sharing. Families slept close together, often packed shoulder to shoulder beneath layers of quilts, blankets, and furs. Children slept between parents. Elderly members were given the warmest spots, usually near the fire or central heat source. A single warm body might save another from hypothermia. The heat banking system extended beyond objects and stone. It included how they slept, how they moved, and how they lived during the darkest, coldest hours. This wasn't just survival. It was a choreography of warmth, learned through experience and passed down like sacred knowledge. By mastering how to trap and circulate heat, These families weren't just building fires, they were building microclimates with every stone and blanket playing a role. They didn't just fight the cold, they engineered their lives around it. Out on the frontier, food wasn't just nourishment, it was survival strategy. In a world without refrigeration, grocery stores, or resupply caravans, every meal eaten in January had to be planned for in July. And while summer threatened rot and pests, winter brought its own dangers. Not the absence of cold, but too much of it. Vegetables could freeze solid and turn to mush. Meats could crack and spoil from freeze-thaw cycles. And when blizzards cut families off for weeks, hunger became an ever-present shadow. Frontier food preservation was equal parts art and science, passed down not by recipe cards, but by worn hands and instinct. It was a network of methods, each compensating for the failure of another. Because if even one link broke, it could mean malnutrition, sickness, or death. The foundation of this system was the root cellar, a simple, dirt-cooled chamber dug deep below the frost line. There, families stored potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions, packed in straw, sand, or sawdust. The goal wasn't freezing, it was stable cold, hovering just above freezing to preserve texture and nutrients. Families tracked temperature by feel, not thermometer, adjusting airflow with wooden shutters or cracks in the rock walls. Above ground, preserved meats hung like trophies of foresight. Hickory smoke, dense and bitter, coated venison, bare and foul in antimicrobial layers. Meats were salted, pressed, wrapped in cheesecloth, and hung high in rafters, away from rodents and moisture. Some families used cold porches or exterior cabinets, shaded from sun, where wind acted as a natural fridge. Animal fats, lard, tallow, bear grease were rendered down into golden, dense oils and poured into ceramic crocks or wooden tubs, forming airtight seals. Into these, they packed cooked meat, beans, or vegetables, effectively creating early versions of canned food, shelf-stable for months. But perhaps most surprising was their command of fermentation. Without knowing microbiology, they mastered it anyway. Cabbage turned to sauerkraut, rich in vitamin C. Milk curdled into cheese or thick curds. Beets bubbled into kvass, and leftover grains fermented into sour mash starters or beer yeast. Glass was rare, so these living concoctions thrived in stoneware crocks, often stored in cool corners of the kitchen like sacred chemistry experiments. And they kept records. Ration books, handwritten and thumb-stained. Every family member had a daily caloric target. The child, the pregnant mother, the old man with weak teeth. These books tracked how many servings remained of dried apples, how much salt pork was left, and whether the pickled egg supply could stretch through March. One bad count, one underestimated storm, and someone could go hungry. Preservation wasn't just about food, it was about strategy, anticipation, and discipline. Families learned to ration without despair, using flour sparingly, substituting cornmeal, brewing weak teas from forage bark and dried herbs. They even saved bone marrow for soup stock and ground old bread into porridge thickeners. Pests were another enemy. Rodents could destroy a season's work in days. So food was hung from rafters, sealed in clay, or buried in hidden pits lined with ash and stone to deter rats and bugs. Some families crafted false walls and pantries, hiding food reserves in case of theft, from strangers or even desperate neighbors. When times grew lean, they turned to wild preservation, drying mushrooms found under logs, grinding acorns into flour, smoking squirrel meat, or trapping small birds. Nothing was wasted, nothing was assumed. Preservation was preparation, and preparation was survival. This was a food system not built for abundance, but for resilience. It asked a family to be part farmer, part butcher, part scientist, part prophet. And when the wind howled and the snow erased every path, it was this invisible web of planning, preservation, and purpose that kept the cabin lights burning and bellies full, if only just enough. Out on the frontier, water was never guaranteed. Even when the world was buried under 6 feet of snow, it was one of nature's cruelest paradoxes, surrounded by frozen whiteness, yet with nothing safe to drink. Thirst, not hunger, could be the first killer of winter, A single misstep in water storage or purification could mean disease, dehydration, or death. Frontier families developed a complex, multi-tiered water security system that rivaled the sophistication of any food or heat strategy. Snow was not water, at least not the kind you could trust. Melting it took fuel. Purifying it took knowledge. Finding it without risking your life took experience passed down through stories, scars, and careful trial. At the heart of many homesteads was the ice fishing well, a winterized access point to underground water. These wells were often hand-dug, lined with stone or wood, and topped with insulated lids made of moss-stuffed canvas, bark, or even animal hides. These covers kept the top layer from freezing solid, allowing families to draw buckets even in sub-zero temperatures. But wells were vulnerable. A single cracked rope pulley or a dropped bucket could ruin access for days. So backup systems were critical. Families would melt snow, but only from clean sources. They knew to avoid first snowfalls, which carried soot, pollen, and dust. Instead, they collected middle-season snow, skimming top layers and avoiding drifts near livestock, latrines, or chimneys. Clean white snow was melted slowly in heavy iron pots over the fire, a process that demanded constant attention. Melt too fast and you wasted fuel. Too slow and the fire cooled. Once liquefied, water was always boiled, never trusted. The scent of boiling snow became as familiar in winter cabins as wood smoke or bread. Still, melted snow was a last resort. More efficient families prepared in autumn. Rain barrels were sealed tightly and half buried in earth or wrapped in straw to insulate them. These could provide water deep into winter, as long as the top didn't freeze or split. Clay-lined casks were stored indoors, behind stoves or under lofts, where ambient heat could protect them. Contamination was an ever-present fear. One bucket dipped too close to manure, one scoop touched by a sick child, and dysentery could wipe out a family in a week. To defend against this, frontier families built rudimentary filters. Layers of charcoal, sand, moss, and linen cloth lined barrels or pails. Water was poured through slowly, catching silt, microbes, even the occasional insect. Not perfect, but better than nothing. And when the worst happened, when diarrhea, fever, or coughing fits began, families turned to birch bark tea. Simmered gently, it was known to be antimicrobial, a natural remedy passed down by indigenous neighbors or discovered through harsh necessity. Some added pine needles for vitamin C or mixed in chokeberry or juniper bark for immune strength. The cabin might be cold, but there was always a pot of something warm and bitter simmering, not just for comfort, but for survival. And there was no margin for carelessness. A family might last a week without food, 3 days without water, they'd never make it. That's why every household had multiple containers in rotation, a pail for drawing, a barrel for storage, a jug for heating, and a tin for medicine. Buckets were kept covered with wooden lids or cloth wraps, not just for insulation, but to keep mice and insects from contaminating the precious liquid. In the deepest part of winter, when snow piled against the windows and wind screamed across the plains, it was this quiet, meticulous attention to water, this unseen war with ice and bacteria, that made the difference between a cabin that endured and one that stood silent by spring. The world might have frozen, but the families that survived never stopped flowing forward, one boiled bucket at a time. Out on the frontier, clothing wasn't comfort. It was survival gear. Every stitch, every layer, every patch of hide or fur was a deliberate engineering choice. With temperatures plunging to 40 below, fashion was irrelevant. What mattered was whether your coat could hold heat when the fire died at 3 a.m. What mattered was if your boots could stop frostbite from reaching your toes before sunrise. Layering was a science, born not in textbooks but at the edge of life and death. Against the skin, linen or tightly woven wool, soft but breathable. Over that came insulation layers, down-stuffed jerkins, quilted cotton, or fur vests made from rabbit, fox, or muskrat. The outer layer was always windproof, oiled canvas, waxed leather, or greased hides, treated with animal fat to resist sleet and snow. These coats were heavy, stiff, and often stank, but they kept the cold out and the life in. Mothers were the tailors of life. By firelight and candle stubs, they hand-stitched gloves lined with rabbit fur, hats ringed with squirrel tail, and boots reinforced with straw padding. For children, they made sleeping shirts, full-body tunics sewn from thick blankets, layered like cocoons, meant to trap warmth during long, fireless nights. But the feet were sacred. Wet, cold feet meant death. That's why boots were stuffed with dried moss, wool scraps, or straw, all changed daily to keep them dry. Soles were rubbed with tallow or pine pitch, turning leather into a crude waterproof shield. Socks were layered, dried at the hearth every night, and patched until they resembled bundles of cloth more than garments. There were no spare clothes. Garments were patched to the brink of collapse. A single worn-out coat could doom a man gathering firewood. That's why every hole was mended on site, every seam reinforced with bone needles and animal sinew thread, stronger and more flexible than anything store-bought. Even broken fasteners were replaced with carved toggles, scraps of antler, or knotted cords. In many homes, there was a garment rotation system, outdoor clothes for snow and labor, hung to dry immediately after use. Indoor wear layered and kept near the fire. In deeper winter, families often shared body heat, sleeping together under one mound of blankets, fully clothed, boots lined up beside the bed in case of midnight emergencies. Clothing wasn't protection from the elements. It was protection from death. And on the coldest nights, stitched warmth often mattered more than walls. Food kept you moving, but fire kept you alive. No resource on the frontier was more critical, more precious, or more carefully monitored than fuel. Families didn't just burn wood. They planned fire. They measured time in cords, not clocks. And if you didn't have enough by the first snow, you didn't make it to spring. 6 cords of wood per adult. That was the benchmark. Not optional, not negotiable. That meant dozens of trees felled, chopped, split, and stacked before the first frost. Cutting in winter was suicide. Axes froze, wood cracked, hands stiffened. You harvested before the freeze, or you paid the price later. But not all wood was equal. Families knew their trees like old friends. Oak, hickory, and maple burned long and hot. These were prized for night fires and deep winter storms. Pine, cedar, and poplar burned fast. Good for kindling, bad for heat retention. Softwoods smoked more and sparked, which meant risk. Hardwoods were gold. Stacking wasn't casual, it was architecture. Logs were raised on platforms to stay dry, stacked with airflow gaps, covered with oilcloth or bark sheets to shed snow. Many families built woodsheds with slanted roofs, slatted walls for ventilation, and log rotation schedules to ensure the driest wood was used first. Inside, fire wasn't just lit, it was managed like a living creature. Families kept burn charts, handwritten records mapping which wood types lasted longest, which logs gave off the best heat at 2 a.m., or how long a split hickory piece smoldered before needing stoking. They even developed burning cycles, mixing fast and slow logs to keep warmth stable overnight while using the least fuel possible. And when the stack ran low, the rules changed. Emergency fuels kicked in: dried dung, bark bundles, even braided corn husks or rush mats soaked in fat. Anything combustible had value. Old furniture, broken tools, dried out thatch, everything was potential fire. Some families kept crisis caches, hidden bundles of hardwood under floorboards or in nearby trees, reserved for final storms. In true desperation, entire families would retreat to a single survival room, usually the kitchen. They sealed off the rest of the cabin with blankets, nailed boards, or furniture. One fire, one room, one last hope. The rest of the house went dark and silent, sacrificed to conserve fuel. Because when the fire went out on the frontier, so did the future. Survival on the frontier wasn't luck. It was knowledge, grit, and generations of hard-won skill. From fire to food, from clothing to fuel, every choice meant life or death. If you want more real stories of how people truly lived, like the video and subscribe to the channel.